Okay, go ahead.
Okay. As you see, this is all new to me, and it is very, it goes very wrong. Anyhow, my name is Henny Savenije, and I've been in Korea indeed for 26 years, and I've done a lot of research on Hendrick Hamel. I want to show you, of course, I want to show you my website because there's most of the information. You have to put the volume down. Okay. Okay. And again, something went wrong. This is not only unfamiliar to me because I have to speak to a monitor and I can see only 3 faces, and one of them is even actually myself. So Stephen, if you would sit there so I can look at somebody.
I'll move over here so you can look at an audience.
Yeah. Anyhow, I'm going to talk about Hendrick Hamel. Many of you will not be familiar with the story, but in 1653, a Dutch ship shipwrecked on the coast of Jejudo. Originally, they were heading for Nagasaki, but in a typhoon, they came into Jejudo. The ship broke into 100 pieces, and they were trapped in Jejudo. After all kind of adventures, they had to go to the court in Jejudo, and they stayed 9 months in Jejudo. After that, they were brought to the court of the king, and from the 64 people on board, only 36 survived. The rest died. There are all kind of funny experiences in this story, but first I want to talk to you how I came to do this research. I have always been very interested in the history of Asia. And in the Netherlands, I found many books about China and nothing about Korea. Korea was tabula rasa. There was nothing. And then in the late 1970s, I found suddenly this book. And this was the only book which I could find about Korea. And now I hear my echo. Then in 1997 or 1996, I'm not so sure, I was in Korea and somebody else wrote a book about the same subject. And of course, I was interested, and it was in English. When I read that book, I realized, hey, that's different from the book I have read in the Netherlands. I want to know how this is possible. And that's where the journey started. I went to the archives searching for the original manuscripts. And here it is. Well, it's not the original, it is a copy. And if I keep it a little bit closer, you can see how the beautiful handwriting is. And to make it easy for you,
I can't see it because you're sharing your website screen.
Oh.
So you have to go to the top and do stop sharing.
Okay, wait, I will show you on my website where it exactly is, because that's easier. Yeah. Oh, wait a moment. Yeah, okay, this is in Korean. Doesn't matter, because if you click on my Korean name, you get to the original manuscript. Now, here you see I have transcribed everything, so it is also possible for other people to check what I have done is correct. And of course, most of you will not be able to understand the Dutch. I can see that too. And to make it easy, or maybe not, I made a word-to-word translation. Here, in very weird English, an means to, etc., etc., etc. You can read through the manuscript as close as possible as the Dutch wrote it. or Hamel wrote it. And if you're interested, of course, and that's not easy. I can understand that too. And that's only interesting for historians. Oh, I wanted to go somewhere else. It doesn't matter. I can go there very quickly. Delete. And I'm back to the menu. If you only want to read a modern translation, which is also possible, you can go here. And this is a modern translation. And again, as close as possible, but in readable English, you can read the journal. But how did this journal came to happen? Okay, again, I will make a short summary of the story and what has happened to them in Korea, because I have only 45 minutes and I have 2,000 pages there. So I can only tell you a very short part of that. Okay, so they came in Jejudo in 1653, and they stayed 9 months in Jejudo, were interrogated by the governor over there, and they wanted to go to Nagasaki. That's what they made clear. And of course, the Koreans could not understand Dutch, and of course the Dutch could not speak Korean. But somehow they managed to convey their wants and what they wanted. And actually, after 9 months, quite a few of them started to speak some Korean. There is one important thing. The governor, Lee Won-jin, asked them, Christian imnika, are you Christians? And they said, yeah, yes. And further on in the story, that becomes important. Anyhow, the governor wrote to the king, and finally, after 9 months, the king said, okay, send them to Seoul. In Seoul, they had to, be in front of the king. And the king asked them all kinds of questions. They had to dance, they had to sing. And of course, they're not really singers and they're not really dancers, but they did what they had to do. I forgot one thing. There's one important person they met in Jejudo, and that man was specially sent to Jejudo by the king. And that man was Jan Janse Weltevree, by the Koreans known as Park Yon. That man has been in Korea since 1628, and he managed to become a counselor of the king. He was an important man. And after so long staying in Korea, he could barely speak Dutch. He had to learn his own mother tongue again. Anyhow, when they arrived in Seoul, Weltevree or Park Yon did all the translation work for them. And finally, it was decided by the king that they would become the lifeguard of the king. And that's also interesting because, first of all, why didn't he send them to Nagasaki? First question, why did they have to become the lifeguards of the king? Well, the lifeguard, and that's interesting, there were no Koreans in the lifeguard. There were only Japanese who fled from Japan or Chinese who had fled from China in the lifeguard. That basically meant that the king did not trust his own people to protect his life. Now, what I said before, they proclaimed to be Christians. And now, in 1945, Park Yon came to Korea in 1628, and he could stay. But actually, the Koreans did even efforts to send him to Japan, but the Japanese refused. And then in 1645, a Chinese ship shipwrecked on Korea, and as the custom would be to send them back to China. But these Chinese didn't want to go back to China, they wanted to go to Japan. And when they arrived in Japan, the Japanese discovered that they were Christians and they were beheaded. And of course, the Koreans knew that. So with the question, Christian imnika, basically they signed their verdict that they had to stay in Korea because according to the Koreans, they would be killed in Japan. Okay, so now they stayed for 3 years in Seoul. In those 3 years, as lifeguards, they had to pay for their own guns and they had to pay for their own. And how did they get money? Again, from the king. The king provided them at least with food, with housing, etc. Every time the Chinese envoy would enter into Korea, the Dutch crew was sent away to Namansanson. They had to stay there in the fortress because the king, the Korean court, did not want the Chinese to know that they had these Dutch people. They had high expectations of these people. They thought that these Dutch people could maybe teach them all kind of science, etc. Anyhow, Park Yon did actually. That's why Park Yon is a much more interesting figure than Hamel himself. But unfortunately, Park Yon never wrote anything. Unfortunately. After 3 years, the winter was so cold that the men asked the king if they could stay in Seoul instead of going to Namansanson, and the king granted that. Unknown to the others, at least that's what they say, 2 of them sneakily went to the route of the Chinese governor and when hid in the bushes, and under their Chinese clothes they had Dutch clothes, and when the the consul came, they jumped out of the bushes and shouted, "We are Dutchmen, we are Dutchmen!" And of course, the Chinese could not understand them. The Koreans were very upset because they were upsetting this Chinese envoy. And very soon they were captured and put into prison where they died. Unknown to the others. Unknown also to the others is why they died. Once in prison, they decided not to eat. And the Koreans were very worried about that. But they died basically by their own choice. Okay, that was that part. But in the meantime, the court was in upheaval. Sorry, I'm thinking too much in Dutch, so because I'm. But anyhow, so what happened? Basically, the other councillors, all said to the king, "Let's kill them." No, 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 no. So the king said, "We're not going to do that." Then that's dishonorable. Then some Korean councillors thought to be smart, and they said, "Okay, let's take 1 Dutchman and 2 Koreans and fight against each other. So in that way, they die an honorable death." And the king said, "No, that's not going to happen." They asked Park Yon several times, "What's going to happen? Will we live?" And Park Yon, the philosopher that he was, he said, "If you're still alive tomorrow, you will live." And eventually, yes, the king decided, we cannot keep them here. Let's send them to Jeollanam-do, the south of Korea. There is a main fortress over there where the southern command was established, and it's one of the few fortresses which is not on a mountain. And there's a small village, now a small village, maybe at that time it was bigger, but a small village called Byongyang. And they stayed there for 7 years. What happened in those 7 years, I have no idea, because nobody really writes about that. But most likely, I have no proof of that, but most likely they married and had children. After 7 years, there were after 4 years, there was a famine. And the next year, there was a famine. And again, the next year, there was a famine. 3 years of shortage of food. And yeah, the commander of the fortress, he wrote to the king, I cannot feed them anymore. Shall we send them to the 3 different cities? And the king, in the meantime, a different king, said, okay, let's do that. And so 12 people went to Suncheon, 5 people went to Namwon, and 6 people went to Namwon, and 6 other people went to Yosu. Now, if you calculate quickly, that's a lot less than 36. What happened to the other people? No idea. Probably they just died, sickness, hard work, or whatever. Nobody writes about it. Maybe there are some records somewhere, but till now, nobody ever found that. Wait a moment, we're still looking at my website. We're not looking at me anymore, right? Maybe the people would like to see me.
Yeah. And I can't see this screen well enough to know which button to push at the top. I'm sorry.
In the meantime, I will keep on talking.
Stop sharing is what we want to do.
Yeah.
Actually, this one. So.
Okay, all kind of talks is going on here. And I understand most of you don't really want to see. I will finish the story. In the meantime, they're trying to make me visible. Then after 3 years in the 3 different cities, 8 decided to escape to Japan. Why did they want to escape?
Maybe we stop sharing. Polygon going on.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm in the picture now, I think.
Back,
yeah. Why did they wanted to escape? Sometimes they were treated very well by the governors who were in charge, and sometimes they were treated very bad by the governor. Not by the same governors, but by different governors. And they decided, we have to leave this country because we will end up dead and not a good life anyhow. So what happened next was they decided to buy a boat, which was not so easy because basically the Koreans refused to sell them a boat. Finally, with the help of a Korean friend, they managed to buy a boat. And under the disguise of a party, they prepared to go to Japan. Only 8 men could fit in that boat. And in the evening, after the party was over, the party was not over. They kept on going all night. And basically, the Koreans got fed up. They were curious, but they got fed up and decided to go home. And when everybody was gone, they quickly furnished the boat, uncovered the boat, and set off direction Japan. Now you have to imagine these people had no navigation skills. Well, they had navigation skills, but not to the extent that they really could find Japan. They just knew somewhere to the east there was Japan. And with a little sail, they went, and after 3 days, they saw some land, and they were more or less still scared. It was Korea, but it was already the Goto Islands. Lucky for them, the Japanese saw them, because if they would not discover them, they would have sailed into the Atlantic Ocean, and nobody would ever heard of them again. The Japanese took them eventually to Nagasaki, to Dejima. In Nagasaki, there was a small Dutch mission on a small artificial island. And everybody already thought that these people were dead. And after 13 years, they finally showed up. The Japanese, however, wanted to know everything about what happened to these people in Korea. They wanted to get as much information as possible about Korea. They first questioned everybody in groups of 4, then they did it again individually, and the only ship which could have brought them back to Batavia had to sail away before the Japanese were finished. And as a result, they had to stay 1 year on that small artificial island. Now, that small artificial island is not much bigger than a soccer field, and life was utterly boring there. So the chief of the island told them that they had to write a report. Now, Hamel was actually the only one who could read or write. He was the bookkeeper. And bookkeepers are meticulous, but also boring. Finally, I have to say that this handwritten thing, here I have it, is not literally what Hamel has written. It's a copy. It's a copy which was copied in Batavia, where they would make 6 copies and would send the 6 copies to the Netherlands. But before that, I also want to say that Hamel was the only person who could write. But basically, it's a common story. They all told the story as they experienced it all together. So one thing which is very noticeable in the document, Hamel never writes about himself as the first person. He always writes about himself as the third person. Okay, so this document was copied in the Netherlands and was sent to with 6 different ships to the Netherlands, and there somehow 3 different publishers laid hand on that copy. And they published books. And unfortunately, these books were all different. I cannot show you a Dutch copy because I don't have. On my website, I have some images. But I can show you, for instance, the translation, which was unfortunately made of the most inaccurate translation. For instance, this. Oh, here you can see some, this one is in French. And from French, it was translated into English, which is also in this version. And of course, as happens with every translation, there will be mistakes. Things were interpreted in a different way, and therefore many mistakes were thought to be, this is the English version. Oh, I have to go a different way. Here you can see the English version. And for a long time, that was the only information other countries had about Korea. Was Hamel, that was my question when I read all these different books, was Hamel accurate? He was accurate beyond belief. I realized that many of the translations which I have seen made many mistakes too. For instance, at one point, he wrote that the distance from Busan to another city was 200 kilometers, or 190, not so important. And when I read the handwriting, it doesn't say Osaka, it says Oaxaca. And then somebody told me, yeah, but Oaxaca is the old name for, now I'm looking for a name. The city closest to Japan is, what is it? The city closest to Shimonoseki.
Oh, Shimonoseki.
Yeah.
Oh.
And that was exactly the distance. But everybody thought, no, Hamel has a lot of imagination. The distance from Busan to Osaka is not 200 kilometers. There were more of these kind of mistakes, and by meticulously transcribing the the manuscript, I managed to uncover a bunch of these mistakes. But of course, I'm not infallible, and I hope somebody else will discover other mistakes. But anyhow, that's in short the story. In the due time, I've had a lot of help from many people, sometimes unwillingly, because they were not trying to help me, but they were trying to oppose me, and which motivated me to do my best, because I wanted to prove that I could do it. I have all kind of versions. This is one version. Oh, I have to show there. This is a version which is written by Jean-Paul Buys, who that was the copy I saw first, no, second, which motivated me to start to do research anyhow. This is a children book. I have a whole bunch of children books which were published 100 years ago. Basically, Hamel was also, oh, wait a moment, the camera. Can I change? No, wait, it's already done, I guess.
Yep.
No, it's moving that way.
Yeah, there we go.
Okay, here are two other children books. It's all about Hamel. Yeah, I have more. An interesting book, which is also interesting, is this. And this was an interesting transcription done for the first time, also of the journal. This man makes also some mistakes. I asked historians in the Netherlands, is it useful to do the transcription again? And they all said yes. 100 years ago, they did things often too quickly, and they made many mistakes. Therefore, I have this copy, and I did the manuscript again. I have more interesting books. This one is not mine. The secretary here showed me this. This is also a copy of Hamel, which was printed in, now I forgot, 1950. 1950. The book looks old, but it's not as old as the books I have. I have another version, which I published myself. Unfortunately, Hamel is not so interesting for the Netherlands because we have many of these kind of guys. And the book did not sell very well. In Korea, the man is much more important, and for Korean history too. And this is basically a translation of the work I did. I am being acknowledged also as the source of all this work. If you want to read a Korean version of this, please read this. They're going to republish it, and I don't know how soon, because of Corona, it might be delayed. Okay, do I have more things? Yeah, I have many interesting stuff. And I think after that, we're going to go to the discussion. This is interesting because here you see the Korean coins. This is nothing to do with Hamel. This is, during all my research, I came upon a book of von Ziebold, that was a German doctor who worked in Nagasaki and met Koreans there. The images in that book are quite extraordinary. He was a good artist. Let me take it apart because otherwise it becomes a little bit more difficult. Here he shows us all kind of items from Korea. These items are still in the von Ziebold house in Leiden, I think. The German guy lived for the rest of his life in Leiden, in the Netherlands. Of course, these people are not. But you can see that these are all Koreans. And basically, these are the first images of Koreans. Well, maybe not the first. There are a few more, but the most accurate images of Koreans. He also had a map, hard to see with all the difficult light, but this is a map in Japanese. Actually, von Ziebold is deported from Japan because the Japanese accused him of espionage. These clothes are also still in the Netherlands, maybe not in this composition, but wait a moment, I have a few more. This is the same. Here you can see this house is Japanese, but the people are clearly Korean. And this is maybe also very interesting because this is the first publication of Hangul outside of Korea. He tried to explain, oh sorry, I keep it upside down. You should have told me.
Well, I was thinking it was. But...
Somebody, that's the problem if you don't, if there's no audience with you.
Or if your audience doesn't have good vision.
Okay, I have a few more maps and material, but I think basically this is the most important material there is. And I think this is also the time to go back to discussion time.
All right.
And it's my time to drink something because I've been talking a lot.
All right, does anybody have questions? Our setup here is pretty feeble. I'm getting seasick watching the camera move. Any questions for Henny?
Right. Yes, Steve, I have one.
Okay, who have I got?
That's
Russell. Okay,
yeah.
Russell, go ahead.
Yeah, look, yeah, Henny, interesting, thank you. And I'm just wondering, like 8 of the Dutch escaped from Korea, but there are also 8 who remained there. Is there any evidence of their descendants or any record of them whatsoever?
Evidence? No, there is. I don't know. Wait a moment. Oh, I have the camera. I have to get the camera back.
Let's just leave the camera over there.
Yeah. Okay. No, there is no real evidence. There's a lot of conjecture. There was a Korean man, Kim Tae-jin, if my memory serves me well, who has visited everybody with the last name Nam. The Koreans gave the Dutch people Korean names, and they all gave them the surname Nam for the simple reason, for the Koreans, these people came from the south. Nam is south. Is there any proof? I've been to Cholanamdo several times. Yes, I've seen Korean people with blue eyes there. I have seen Korean people with blondish hair. Are they descendants from the Dutch? I don't know. Kim Tae-jin has visited several people, and he was convinced that everybody with the surname Nam was a descendant from the Dutch. I'm not so convinced, because in the diaries of Lee Soo-jin, there are also several generals with the surname Nam. So I'm not so convinced. Did they leave a lot of things behind in Cholanamdo? Yes, again, let me put it this way. What I've seen over time is that commerce and fantasy has basically done and is still doing a lot of harm to this historical story. For instance, Hamel writes that Park Yon or Jan Janse Weltevree said that he came from De Rijp, which is a small village up north in the Netherlands on the west coast. But the name Weltevree does not occur there, and through all kind of links I have made with all kind of documents, I am convinced he does not come from there, but he comes from a city close to Amsterdam. But in the Rijp, they have a statue of Jan Janse Weltevree. They have a museum dedicated to Jan Janse Weltevree, and they want to keep that image alive. And there is no historical proof which I can make which will convince them that they have to change that. Here in Korea, I've seen several things like that too. Jejudo, I am 100% sure I located the beach where they were stranded. But the locals, or some locals, I should say, tried to convince me that he didn't strand there, but 100 meters further, which was in their jurisdiction and would be interesting for them. Even in the Netherlands, the house where Hamel is born was demolished, and they have rebuilt a house which, yeah, basically fantasy, but they claim it to be the birthhouse of Hamel. So is there any proof till now, to answer your question, is there any real proof? No. But personally, I am convinced that there are descendants. What happened to the other 8? There are 2 versions. Sorry. There is one version, the historical one. After 1 year, the Dutch wanted to have those people back. They wrote letters to Japan. Japan wrote letters to Korea. And finally, Korea sent back 7 people to Japan. And many years later, one of these survivors claimed to the burgomaster or the mayor of Amsterdam that this man wanted to stay behind because he was married to a Korean and he had no Christian hair in his body anymore. Oh, nice quote. If it's true, maybe. We don't know. There is, again, no real scientific evidence. The best thing we could do is genetic research. If there is one man working at the Dutch embassy, and he claims that Park Jan was his ancestor. And from Park Jan, we know he was married and had children in Korea. He had at least 1 son and at least 1 daughter, but in Korean, that can also be more. So most likely these people have been wed and most likely have, yeah, descendants. And I'm also pretty sure that in that little village down south, there have been descendants of these Dutch people. While I was doing my research, at a certain moment, I was contacted by a man, a Japanese man. And he asked me, is it possible that one of these people escaped to Japan? Because he knew that one of his ancestors was Dutch in the male line. We have met each other many times, and actually he has helped me with translating a lot. Suddenly my vision is gone. Oh, sorry. He has helped me a lot with translating Japanese and Korean documents. My knowledge of Hanja is not that great, and probably I could make some kind of translation, but it wouldn't be very accurate. And he helped me to do that. This man was different. I've been in Japan, and he was different from other Japanese. He was much more outgoing. He was humorous. He could laugh out loud. And those things I have never seen in Japan when I was in Japan. For him, I'm sure he has a Dutch ancestor, and actually he can prove it. He knows the grave of his ancestor, his Dutch ancestor. Unfortunately, the name of his ancestor is written in kanji. And if you transcribe that back into Dutch, unfortunately, you have too many possibilities. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you. That is very interesting. Yeah, I think just a DNA study would be the only way you could that up. Yeah. Thank you.
Is there anyone else with questions?
You can notice that Stephen was a preacher. He likes to shout out.
Well, I'm across the room from the mic, so.
There was a written question.
A written question. Oh, here we go. To my memory, Hamel never mentions mundane things like what he had to eat. What were the guiding principles of his memoir?
What were the
Guiding
guiding?
principles of his report.
Well, I'm not so sure if I understand the question.
He doesn't mention anything about eating, what kind of food they ate.
Oh yeah.
Did he have some particular focus for the report?
The focus was a report for the the VOC in Batavia, for the governors in Batavia. That was
VLC was
the
what?
VOC.
VOC,
Is the Dutch East Indian
Dutch
Company.
East India Company. So it was more of a commercial sort of a proposal.
It was, yeah, no. One of the guidelines of the VOC was that if anybody came into a country which was not visited by one of the other members of the company, they had to report about. So that was basically the reason why he wrote it, or they wrote it, but Hamel was the one who did the writing. He doesn't write about the food. Yeah, occasionally he does, actually. But basically they get from the king a quota of rice. And they had to take care of their additional food themselves. So most likely they bought, that's known, they bought houses in Pyongyang. Also, they were begging for money among monastery, etc., because they discovered that begging was not dishonorable. And they visited in that way many monasteries and got, yeah, probably they ate a lot of Korean food. Yeah. Does that answer your question, Brother Anthony?
Yeah, it was not my question, it was somebody else's question.
Oh, okay.
You did not mention the crocodiles.
Ah, the crocodiles.
The crocodiles. Famous crocodile, only in French and English.
Yeah, right.
The French edition of the journal introduces crocodiles which were known to eat people.
Yeah,
We
right.
don't really know where they came from.
Where they came from. Well, actually, the publisher who published, no, sorry, he did not publish the English translation, or the French translation, but the publisher who published the book with the crocodiles thought that the book was not interesting enough, and he added crocodiles and elephants, not to forget. And in that way, he hoped to make the book more interesting so that more people would buy it.
Well, he did, yes.
And probably he was successful with that, because that's also the best preserved copy. But there are the other copies are also preserved in the royal libraries in The Hague. If you want to see them, bring your gloves with you, because you're not allowed to touch them.
Okay. Is there anybody else that would like to question the world's leading authority on Hendrick Hamel?
Well, I do have just one more.
Go ahead.
Okay. Well, we know, like in Japan at Dejima, the Dutch were there and the Japanese, there was a lot of transfer of knowledge and technology. Was there a noticeable transfer of knowledge and technology because of Hamel and his compatriots living in Korea?
I can make a short answer to that. No. But Park Yun was smart. Park Yon was smart in many different ways. You can tell by the way he gives philosophical answers. He doesn't really answer questions, but he gives roundabout answers. For instance, when Hamel asked, the crew asked Batavia, can we go to Japan? He just said, if you were a bird, you can go to Japan. But this country does not allow you to go there. Batavia taught the Koreans to make better guns and better cannons. And now my memory fails me. Oh yeah. At a certain moment, I came upon the word bulanji, and I was baffled. What would that be? And little by little, I discovered that the Franks, they have been in China, and they taught the Chinese also how to make guns or cannons. And the Franks were called by the Chinese Bulangi because they can't say Frank. And that word came into Korea, and yes, these cannons made by, or not made by, but under the guidance of Park Yon, they were called Bulanji. And therefore, some of this knowledge about making better armory, if there's more, I have no idea. Most likely there will be, but it's not recorded. Again, if you look at Byongyang, the little village where they lived for 7 years. Okay, no, wait, I will tell you a funny anecdote. The first time I went with a journalist to Byongyang, in Byongyang there is a nice big ginkgo tree, and it says the tree is 600 years old or something like that. And under the tree there's a sign, Hamel and his crew is believed to have sat there because in the shade. Okay, fine. I can believe that, it's a big tree. Yeah, okay, fine. The first time I went there with a journalist, and our guide very proudly said, oh, they live there. And I was like, how do you know that? Well, they were always sitting under this tree, so they must have lived there. And the second time I went there with another journalist, he said, oh, but they were always drinking there because, yeah, again, why? How do you know that? Well, the villagers did that, and they still do that. So he must have done that. Okay, fine. Proof. No proof whatsoever. Basically, what I'm saying is there is a lot of folklore going on. If you go to that village, they have, for instance, this pattern which you can find in many Dutch cities. The bricks are in a fishbone pattern, yeah, like this, the streets. And yes, you can find that in Byongyang as well. But I discovered that in the whole Cholanamdo, you can find that. And I don't believe that that custom went from that one village to the whole of Cholanamdo. Of course, it's possible, but not in my perception. So if there is anything, yeah, most likely they have. But again, Hamel doesn't write anything about those 7 years in Byongyang, and the official records, no, they're not mentioned anywhere. They were not important enough. Of course, there are other peculiarities. If he describes his journey from Jejudo to Seoul, he mentions every village they met. And then suddenly, after Gwangju, they are in Seoul. And why is that? After they were banished to Byongyang, to Cholanamdo, they were not allowed to come near Busan and near Seoul. So basically, that was the border to where they traveled as monks, or no, not as monks, sorry, as beggars, because they did travel inside the Korea. And I'm also pretty sure they have told the monks also a lot of things. So if there is any, yeah, likely, but hard to prove.
There's a comment here about food. It would be interesting to know what the food might be like. So we have records or the story of Marco Polo going to China, and he never mentioned tea. So, what was the food like for Hamel and his crew? We probably never know what Korean food was like then.
No.
Yeah.
For as far as I know, he doesn't write much about food. Was it interesting for them? I think as a subject for them, it was not interesting. Was because for them, most likely it was not much different than the food they had in Indonesia, and maybe not even much different from the food they had on the ship. You have to imagine that these guys have been a while on a ship. They had to get food from Indonesia, and most likely that was not Dutch food. That was Indonesian food or Chinese food. Before they left Batavia, they also went to Taiwan because the governor in Taiwan was dead, and they had to transfer the new governor to Taiwan. So over there too, they had to stay for a while. They ate most likely the local food. Was Korean food so much different from Indonesian food or Chinese food for them? I don't think so. You want to make some advertisements?
I do. Yeah.
Okay, let's do that
They
together.
were very hungry. They were very hungry.
You do your book, I do my book.
All right. We do have in the RAS office Hendrick Hamel's journal for it's 15,001. If you're in Korea, we can get that to you a lot more easily than if you're not in Korea because of the postal problems. The next lecture is going to be on June 9th with Jocelyn Clark, and that will also be by Zoom. Tomorrow, day after tomorrow, on Thursday is our literature club. And this coming Saturday, we have an architectural tour of Cheongdeok Palace at 9:30 a.m., but you need to pre-register.
I don't want to be.
So get in touch with Joanne at the office or through the website. Want to thank Henny for spending his evening with us. We hope that you all had an interesting time listening, and we'll bid you good night. Thanks for joining us, and have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Over here to end the meeting.